So one other question I have is where does the Canadian left go from here? As we've seen the NDP and the Greens, and I actually didn't even ask you about I know there's a regional party in Quebec as well, which I assume is like left of center, Bloc Quebecois, or
Bloc
maybe it's not.
Quebecois. Yeah.
Yeah.
They play a really interesting role because on certain issues, they're left of center and are a really important and strong voice, particularly on climate. They're a really important ally on climate. But then they have some other positions and policies that are not progressive. So they're unique because they're national sovereigntist party for Quebec and having Quebec's interests represented federally. So they're an interesting mixed bag.
Did they lose seats in this election?
I think they lost some, but not as much as the NDP. The NDP, there was quite a lot of Quebec that pivoted to the Liberals and enabled their minority government win, but they didn't, they still have party status. They still retained some important numbers. Where we really saw the loss was the NDP took the largest hit for sure.
And so back to the question before I sidetrack us is like, where do you think the Canadian left goes from here? At least the electoral left.
Yeah, the electoral left will be in an interesting phase and one that I hope they take as an opportunity. So with Jagmeet Singh stepping down as leader, there'll be a leadership race, and I've heard whispers of a few different voices who are going to be contenders in that. But basically, the left in Canada has gravitated towards the center, especially as they've made the governance agreement with the Liberal Party in the last government. I think a lot of people, they've done some things over the past few years that have really disappointed a lot of people who are on a more progressive left. And my hope is that this is an opportunity now that you see the Liberals really maintaining and gaining in their role as a centrist party, that the NDP decides that it's worthwhile for them to differentiate themselves, for them to take up that stronger leftist position, because I think there's a lot of people in Canada who are feeling politically homeless now that the NDP has lost this amount of power. But if the NDP can address that by rebuilding its base and being willing to evolve to play a role that is able to build momentum with a more progressive base, I think that would be really important for electoral politics in Canada.
Is there any chance you think within the Liberals that they have a bunch of further left progressive sort of votes who just help them pull out this election? Do you think there's any possibility that will influence them to more progressive in some of their policies?
I hope so. It really depends on how Mark Carney chooses to govern. Trudeau kept a pretty tight ship. I think particularly there were some liberal climate people who were elected. And so I'm optimistic that on the climate file too, there will be new Liberal Party members who will be strong advocates within the Liberal Party. But I think it really depends on both how Mark Carney governs, and the litmus test for that will be coming up pretty soon, I think. And then also where those new voices and champions are, it will depend on whether they're willing to move away from that all of the above approach, where they're trying to capitulate to Alberta in the name of national unity, thinking that they're going to get some type of trade-off or agreement to get other support for other issues or even win over some of the base in Alberta. But really, they've tried that strategy before and it never seems to work out for them. You're never going to win over big oil to stop fighting for expanding fossil fuels. You're never going to win over conservative Daniel Smith supporters to get on board and wave the Liberal flag, but they consistently hope to pull from that audience.
Yeah, that's a common theme within the Democrats in the U.S. as well. Whether they say for every white working class voter they lose, they gain 2 Republicans in the suburbs, which has never happened and probably never will.
Yeah.
And one other actually important element, which I wanted to ask about particularly within this context of where the left goes, is First Nations. How did Mark Carney and the Liberals reach out to the First Nations communities to support them? Where are they landing on all of this?
It's complex, I think. There's hundreds of First Nations across Canada, and different nations have different relationships with different political parties and with the political system at large. Like, I think all politicians now do outreach and make gestures and try and build support with nations. But yeah, it's an interesting time because Trudeau's government really, in narrative, tried to be a government of reconciliation and moved some things forward, but the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was an important reckoning in Canada, like most of those calls to action have not yet been fulfilled. I think now it seems, like I said, it's sort of nation to nation really at the end of the day, because different nations have been able to either find success working with governments or been really disappointed and let down by governments not being able to fulfill their end of the bargain, their treaty obligations. So I'd say there's not really like an overarching answer for that, but certainly politicians still try to have good relationships. But I think this is where we see some tension, or where we will see tension around this idea of national unity and nation building projects, is because coming back to this pipeline example, to build a cross Canada pipeline, you cross hundreds, potentially, or at least many tens of nations' territories. You need consent for that.
And pipeline projects has definitely been an area of contention with First Nations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is part of coming back to what I was saying about the opportunity for the left and this sort of funny space of a revival around a conversation about Canadian identity and Canadian pride is, I think on the left, if this conversation is happening, we don't want it to be won over by the people who would advocate for a Canadian identity that is nativist or based on exclusion. If this is the conversation that now is suddenly happening because of the threats to Canadian sovereignty from Trump, how do we use this moment and meet this moment to say, we are not going to be shy about the settler colonial state of Canada and what it is and has been, but we are here, and how are we going to evolve this? How do we protect the things that the rights and freedoms that protect people of all stripes? Like, how do we build on that legacy of the parts of Canada that are good and worth fighting for, while still holding these and acknowledging the harm that the Canadian state has done? And can we build a version of Canadian identity that grapples with that? And I think it's challenging, and I think the left in Canada, especially after the emergence of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the conversation around Canada's colonial impact, a lot of leftists, there's like an ickiness to patriotism that comes from that place. And so we haven't really wanted to touch, I think, sometimes this visionary version of a Canadian state, because there's a discomfort about this question of, do we want to advocate for a Canadian colonial state? What does that look like? To do that in a way that grapples well and acknowledges Indigenous sovereignty and prioritizes that.